I'm Naida Saavedra. I'm a professor at Worcester State University. I'm super happy to talk about this book, Latino Poetry, the anthology. And the goal of this series is to explore what the anthology is telling us about the legacy of the United States, about the legacy of Latinos in the United States. So I'll be talking about voices, identities, and homes. And you can see there the names, the nouns are in plural because there is not only one voice, not one language, not one identity or one home. There are multiple. So multiplicity is one of the characteristics that will connect all these writers that are included in the anthology. So this event is organized by Library of America, and I quoted this from their website. This organization publishes America's greatest writing in authoritative new editions and provides resources for readers to explore this rich living legacy. So the fact that this anthology, Latino Poetry, is part of the catalog of the Library of America is huge. So it's telling us that Latinos are really part of the discourse of the United States, of what the United States means as a nation, right? So then the series of events named Places We Call Home, it's trying to explore the connection between the Latino experience and poetry, making the United States a home, a new home, a second home, some kind of home in which they explore their own experience as immigrants or children of immigrants. So the legacy of Latino poetry is the goal of this anthology. And it's being funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has the mission of exploring but also promoting the importance of humanities in the nation. So this is a big deal. This is not any book. It is not any anthology. This is the Library of America anthology. I love the subtitle that they included on the cover. It's not just any anthology. It is the Library of America anthology. So to talk about the book, you see it is very thick, right? Very thick. Pages are thin. Very thick. So it has more than 500 pages of poems. The book has more than 600 pages, but poems are about 500 pages or more. So it includes more than 180 poets from the 17th century to now, to today. So there are many poets. And the fact that it is important to mention is that not all Latinx poets are included in the anthology. So there are many, many more. And that's important. It is not that, these new immigrants started to write when he just or she just came here. No. People from Latin America have been writing in the United States since the colonial times, right? They wrote letters, chronicles, diaries, and then poetry, and then fiction. So this is nothing new. What is new is the confirmation that this is important to be discussed, that this is important to be shared. So the editor had a difficult job. I haven't talked to him, but this was a difficult job. What poets should I choose to be in this anthology, right? How many pages can I put together in this book? Maybe this is a huge project. And since the event, the goal is to celebrate the legacy and the importance of this anthology, I wanted you to hear him a little bit, to listen what he says a little bit. It's a very short clip, but he talks about the book and the importance of us having access and reading these poems. So he is Rigoberto Gonzalez. He's a professor of English in Rutgers University, and he's also the director of the MFA program. He's also a writer, and he has done a wonderful job.
Latino poetry has a very long and strong tradition here in the United States. And so this is an effort to open the door to further discussions about what makes Latino poetry, who writes it, and what we call Latino poetry. Many poets are trying to examine exactly what home is. You know, the United States is going to be our first home or a second home or a third home, that there really isn't one space that encapsulates our histories and our journeys. We have ancestors who were immigrants, ancestors who were refugees or exiles, but it also acknowledges that we are also looking in ways that we feel at home in our bodies, we feel at home in our languages, feel at home in our identities. You know, we are constantly shifting, we're changing. You know, every generation has a new way of thinking of themselves in the American landscape, but also in terms of the trajectory of their family's history as well. There's also a need to be proud of who we are, especially now when there are so many ways in which we are being told that we don't belong, that we should be gone, should be elsewhere, should leave. I think this is an important statement to make, that we belong here, we always have, and that we're proud to be both American and any other identity that we associate with. Poetry has really reflected that sense of, you know, we're here and we're not going away. We belong here, even though we are undocumented, even though we have been brought here or we came here, but we're here, right? That nothing's going to take us away because we do belong here. We are part of the American fabric. There is still this important sentimental connection to another home, another place. It is interesting to see how even 3 or 4 generations later, there's still this need to remain connected to that ancestry. That's an interesting tension in the work, but I don't think it's contradictory. I think that this is the part where I think Latino identity really thrives in acknowledging and in demonstrating that we're not just one thing, that we're not just one story, that we're not just one people, right? That we can be many different stories. We can be many different peoples. Even one individual can represent that.
He mentioned the multiplicity of what we could find in Latino communities, in Latinx communities, and how the United States has become a second home, maybe a third home, or it could be the first home of so many. And that we, as Latinos, I'm also a Latina writer, we belong here, even though we may not speak the same language, right? We may mix languages. We come from different places. We have different ethnicities. So we are not all Mexicans, right? And we just don't speak Mexican. There are many cultures, many ethnicities. But what may connect us, what really connects us, is that we come with this heritage, right? And we make it here. We make this the new home as we also evolve into a new individual. And all that is expressed in the poetry. So he talks about the importance of recognizing different voices through the poems. So, you know, we see poems from the 17th century through now. Of course, we're going to find different voices, even different use of the language, mixing Spanish and English maybe, all that, but also different experiences, right? If we compare the 20th century, political distress, dictatorships that made communities leave their homes, and then now we have natural disasters, right? Climate crisis. So we'll see all that in all these poems. And then when people come here, their identities change. It is not possible to live with the same identity. Somehow it's going to change. And then identities will be, each individual would have a very own experience or a unique experience of shaping that identity. So we can say that, we are talking about voices and languages. We are, Yes, we're Hispanic, we're Latinos, but we don't speak the same language. It is not the same, a person from Mexico than a person from Argentina. And then if you add on top of that the English, and then maybe this person is from Mexican descent, living in Texas, but it's not the same as living in Massachusetts or living in Miami. So it's not the same being a Cuban exile in Miami that being a third generation Cuban descendant living in New Mexico. It's not the same. The language will change. The voices we hear will change. And then the identities, of course, will be different. Ethnicities and cultures. So it's not, the empanadas are not the same in Venezuela and Argentina. They're not the same. The Caribbean is different than, if you go south, they're going to be baked. No, you got to be north. So they are fried, right? So they're empanadas, but they're not the same. So the thing is, the public discourse may try to put us all in one bag, that we're all the same. And the anthology and Library of America is trying to say, no, they are all different and they are rich. And this is a legacy that is part of the nation. And homes. So, the United States could be the first home if they are born here. It could be the second home. In my case, it could be the third home. Or maybe it's a shared home. If we carry our home with us wherever we go, maybe we're sharing our space. If you can go back to the home you left behind, but if you cannot, right? Or if that previous home is built based on the foundation of the memories that your parents and grandparents told you, but you have never been because you can't. So all that is part of what home is. And it's all related because your voice, what you say, what you write also becomes your home. And it's also your identity. So this is all interconnected, and we're going to be talking about this in the poems I'm going to share. So what is American literature, right? If you go to college and take a class that says American literature, what kind of writers are you going to find? The Latinx literature is usually another course, and it could be considered as ethnic studies, right? So it is an elective class that you can take. It is not mandatory. So it depends on the professor that will decide what text will include in the class, but there is always the sense that Latino literature will be in the margins, right? Not in the center of the discourse, of the discussion. So the importance of the anthology is that the Library of America is bringing this to the center of the discussion. We're not in the margins. We shouldn't be. We are. We shouldn't be in the margins. We're part of the American literature tradition, the canon, the discussion. And we have always been here. Rigoberta Gonzalez said in the video, we belong here, and this is not a new thing. We have always been here for different reasons. Through the years, the communities, the origins will change maybe, but we have always been here. So, that's a discussion, and I think the publication date of this anthology, just came perfect. September, and we're having all these events for a year. In the middle of this political climate, very unstable, and in which we hear a lot the attack to the, anyone who is an immigrant, but of course Latinos, Latinas who come here to steal jobs and to commit crimes and all that. So it is super important that we are here discussing this anthology, in the middle of this, and just I don't know what date it is, like 4 days before, right, the government changes, and then this discourse may be more prevalent in the news. So that's why I'm very honored to be here. So Rigoberto Gonzalez, he was the only editor, which is not usual. Anthologies usually have 2 or 3 editors. It's a huge job to decide what to include, what poems. And since this is a very lengthy book, it was a very a very serious job for Gonzalez. So he had to select poets and then poems of those poets. And everything you find here is very diverse. So we have many centuries, as I mentioned, the 17th century to the 21st century, different places and countries of origin. So there are poets from, the whole continent, places of residence too. So, all cities and states in the nation. Then ethnicities. And we have to remember that, we call it Latin America, right? And then we call them Hispanics, right? But that doesn't mean that their first language would be Spanish, right? There are indigenous writers that maybe learn Spanish after they move to the United States. And then English may become the third language they learn. So it's a very complex community of writers that is included in the anthology. Generations too, of course, through the centuries, but also generations of immigrants. So first generation immigrant, second generation immigrant, third, he talked about ancestors, right? And then how that will be live in the poets through the years, through, their children and grandchildren and so forth. The use of languages, so we find poems in Spanish, in English, in Spanglish, using code switching, going from one language to the other. I have a couple of examples that we're going to share. And then the power of choosing one word or the other to express one idea is also shown in this. And then, of course, different topics, different techniques. From the 17th century to now, you're going to find, of course, different techniques in poetry. And then the topics, you will find many poems talking about the experience of being an immigrant or being a child of an immigrant or trying to find identity for a person who is bicultural, bilingual, for a person who does not speak Spanish but looks like a Hispanic, and all that conflict and struggle is there. So now, Rigoberto Gonzalez had a very difficult job trying to put this anthology together, choosing all these poets and poems. And then I had a difficult job trying to choose some poems to share tonight. We cannot read 500 pages in 1 hour or talk about 180 poets in 1 hour. So I said, okay, so I'm going to choose just a few, some that I love, and that are from 20 and the 21st century. So very modern, contemporary. Some are alive, some have passed. But I also try to include these diverse characteristics of the anthology in the selection of poems that I did for today. So I'm going to share poets from different parts of the country that live in different parts of the country, and there are from different countries too. So I'm going to start with Miguel Piñero, who is one of my favorite poets from New York, from the Nuyorican tradition of performance poetry. He became very famous in the 60s and 70s, and he was one of the founders of the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. So if you go to New York, go to the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. It's still open, it's still having performances, but it's also a kind of not a museum, but you get the experience of the first poets that opened it. So he died young. It was a shame when he died. And he was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in New York. And this is the poem that is included. It's one of his masterpieces. So it's entitled A Lower East Side Poem. Just once before I die, I want to climb up on a tenement sky, to drink my lungs out till I cry, then scatter my ashes through the Lower East Side. So let me sing my song tonight. Let me feel out of sight, and let all eyes be dry when they scatter my ashes through the Lower East Side. From Houston to 14th Street, from 2nd Avenue to the mighty D, here the hustlers and suckers meet the faggots and freaks will all get high on the ashes that have been scattered through the Lower East Side. There is no other place for me to be. There is no other place that I can see. There is no other town around that brings you up or keeps you down. No foot little heat sweeps by fancy cars and pimps, bars and juke salons and greasy spoons make my spirits fly with my ashes scattered through the Lower East Side. A thief, a junkie I've been, committed every known sin, Jews and Gentiles, bums and men of style, runaway child, police shooting wild, mothers futile wails, pushers making sales, dope wheelers and cocaine dealers, smoking pot, streets are hot, and feet of those who bleed to death. All that's true, all that's true, all that is true. But this ain't no lie when I ask that my ashes be scattered through the Lower East Side. So here I am, look at me. I stand proud, as you can see, pleased to be from the Lower East, a street-fighting man, a problem of this land. I'm the philosopher of the criminal mind, a dweller of prison time, a cancer of Rockefeller's ghetto side. This concrete tomb is my home. To belong, to survive, you gotta be strong. You can be shy, lest without request, someone will scatter your ashes through the Lower East Side. I don't wanna be buried in Puerto Rico. I don't wanna rest in Long Island Cemetery. I wanna be near the stabbing, shooting, gambling, fighting, and unnatural dying, and new birth crying. So please, when I die, don't take me far away. Keep me nearby. Take my ashes and scatter them through the Lower East Side. You know, I get goosebumps every time I read this poem. And this is Miguel Piñero. So the concept of home is spread all over the poem, right? And the identity is also there. He was born, the poet, was born in Puerto Rico and grew up in New York. Now the poetic voice, the voice we hear through the poem, is making a point. I wanna be here in the Lower East Side in New York. And we're talking about the southern east side of Manhattan, you know, at the bottom, which is or at the moment, right, during the 70s, was a very dangerous place, a very dangerous neighborhood. And it is described through the verses, to the stanzas, and the shooting, and the gambling, and the drug dealing, and all that. But the poetic voice didn't want to leave. And not just this life. The poetic voice wants to remain there forever, right? The ashes need to stay there forever. So Puerto Rico is not the goal anymore, but it's not either Long Island or, I don't know, the Fifth Avenue, you know, the fancy places. It is that place where the poetic voice found itself and found its own identity. You know, when I talk about this poem, I always ask, we're all gonna die, not today, but we're all gonna die. We cannot escape. Now, think about where you would like your body or ashes to remain when you die. Think about that place, right? And it's a very philosophical question, but it's also a calling of, you know, where you want to be forever, if you think that, you know, your body will remain forever. So it could be called an ode, you know, a poem that is dedicated to an object, and it's supposed to celebrate the characteristics of that object, but all the characteristics that we saw are terrible, right? The neighborhood is terrible, but the poetic voice wants to remain there because that's its home. I chose All American Girl, a poem by Julia Alvarez. Julia Alvarez is a Dominican American, also from New York, but from Dominican Republic. You may know her, she's a very well-known novelist, and some of her novels have been put into plays or have become movies, like In the Time of the Butterflies, for example, is a famous one. But she also writes poems, and I love this one. And then we start to hearing the concept of languages in what the identity is, or the shaping of the identity. So I wanted stockings, makeup, store-bought clothes. I wanted to look like an American girl, to speak my English so you couldn't tell I'd come from somewhere else. I locked myself in the bathroom, trying to match my face with words in my new language. Grimace, leer, disgust, disdain, feelings I had yet to feel in English. And would tristeza even feel the same as sadness with its Saxon sound? Would pity look as soulful as piedad? I didn't know if I could ever show genuine feeling in a borrowed tongue, if cortesia would be misunderstood as brown nosing, or cries of alegría translate as terror. So mirror in my hand, I practice foreign faces, Anglo grins, repressing a native Latin fluency for the cooler mask of English ironies. I wanted the world and words to match again as when I had lived solely in Spanish. But my face wouldn't obey like a tide. It was pulled back by my lunatic heart to its old habit of showing feelings. Long after I lost my heavy accent, my face showed I had come from somewhere else. I couldn't keep the southern continent out of the northern vista of my eyes, or cut my cara off to spite my face. I couldn't look like anybody else but who I was, an all-American girl. So this is a very powerful poem discussing that conflict, that struggle of an immigrant, a young immigrant, becoming an adult, becoming a woman, and trying to define herself through the language, right? And not only herself based on her experience, but of what the others say about her, how others perceive her. And you know, we should also think about the generations, right? And then when many families had to choose English over Spanish to not be discriminated, to be able to function, to be able to have opportunities and access to services and education and so forth. So there are many larger communities of Latinos who may not speak the language as their ancestors, as their parents or grandparents. And then there is a struggle of connecting with that identity, having this loss, like losing the language, right? But at the same time, trying to hide that part of your identity to be able to connect with the rest of the society. But again, you know, the poetic voice said, I lost the accent, but I still look like I come from somewhere else. So we got to the idea of how an American person should look like, right? Do I look like an American person? Why not? What's the standard of the image of an American citizen, right? How my image, my body will define the perception of what you could have over me, right? Then I chose Gloria Anzaldúa, and we go to Chicano literature, Chicanx literature, which brings another issue through the discussion, to the table, which is actually the border and crossing the border, right? Gloria Anzaldúa was born in the United States of Mexican descent, and she is one of the foundational voices of Chicano literature. And she became an activist, and then really remember her as, I would say, the heart of the concept of the border. What the border means, what it means to cross the border every day, which many people do, to work, to go to the doctor, to do whatever, and then to cross other borders that are not physical. I have many students who are Latinos, and then I ask them, when you use the language, when do you use Spanish and when do you use English, for example? And then they have, and we all do, we have to cross that border. You know, when I live here and I go to my house, I'm going to switch to Spanish, right? So I'm crossing that linguistic border. And she talks about this in her books. She was a poet and an essayist, and this is one of her most famous poems, entitled "To live in the borderlands means you are neither hispana, india, negra, española, ni gabacha. Eres mestiza, mulata, half-breed, caught in the crossfire between camps, while carrying all 5 races on your back, not knowing which side to turn to, run from. To live in the borderlands means knowing that the India in you, betrayed for 500 years, is no longer speaking to you. The Mexicanas call you rajetas, that denying the Anglo inside you is as bad as having denied the Indian or black. Cuando vives en la frontera, people walk through you. The wind steals your voice. You are a burra, way, scapegoat, forerunner of a new race. Half and half, both woman and man, neither a new gender. To live in the borderlands means to put chile in the borscht. Eat whole wheat tortillas. Speak Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent. Be stopped by La Migra at the border checkpoints. Living in the borderlands means you fight hard to resist the gold elixir beckoning from the bottle, the pull of the gun barrel, the rope crushing the hollow of your throat. In the borderlands, you are the battleground, where enemies are kin to each other. You are at home, a stranger. The border disputes have been settled. The volley of shots have scattered the truce. You are wounded, lost in action, dead, fighting back. To live in the borderlands means the meal with the razor white teeth wants to shred off your olive red skin. Crush out the kernel, your heart pound, you pinch, you roll, you out, smelling like white bread but dead. To survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, via crossroads. So then, I was just talking about how Americans should look, right? An American person should look. And then this movement a few years ago about I look illegal. And then we have this verse, right? To live in the borderland means to stop by La Migra at the border checkpoints just because you look like you could be undocumented, right? And she was born in the United States, the poet. She could cross the border whenever, but she would be stopped because she looked like someone who shouldn't be here, right? Who doesn't belong here. And we go back to the belonging of Rigoberto Gonzalez was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. And then we connected to the history that Anzaldúa includes in this poem. 500 years of history, right? And then we go back to Aztlan, to the history of the Aztecs, of this land that was not the land of the United States before, right? But the people, and we talked about how the border moved. The people did not cross the border, right? The border moved, and then suddenly they are on this side of the border, right? So then this border crossing, every day, all the time, makes a new identity according to Ansaldúa. And she discussed this in her book. I'm sure after this presentation, you're going to ask Margaret to find the book in the library to check it out. Because it's wonderful to try to think about this. And then if you are from the border and then you move, you're going to carry that with you, right? And she talks about not only being Mexicana or from the United States, but being negra and being indigena, and all these ethnicities are with you, and you will carry them all the time. And it is you would think about it if you have come from another country, how you came, what transportation you had to use to come to this country, but you're always crossing some kind of space. If it is air, if it is water, and then if it is land, as in the case between the United States and Mexico. And that becomes part of your identity. I have a very dear friend, when you ask him, where are you from? He says, I'm from the border. And he doesn't say I'm from Texas or I'm from Mexico. He says, I'm from the border. But where? On the border. Okay. It's because that's their home. The crossing of the border is their home. This friend of mine, for example, has a house on the Mexican side of the border, and then would work on the American side of the border, right? And the half of his family is on one side and the other half is on the other side. So crossing the border is actually a way of living. It is what makes them people, right? So that's why we were talking about first homes, second homes, or maybe a shared home, and this all included in this anthology. And now we go to Miami, right? I wanted to bring Miami too, and the result of, the immigration that is a result of political oppression, right? And we talked about the border, and people, not all of them, but some people are able to cross it to come back, and then many, many, many are not able to do that. And then in some cases, like it has been for Cubans, they were not able to go back to Cuba for decades. It's another experience and then another struggle trying to define that home that it's so far, even though it's so close, but you cannot go back and relive it. So Gustavo Pérez Firmat is one of the writers and poets of a generation of Cubans who came right at the beginning of Castro government in the 1960, 1962, 1964. We see hundreds of children who came to the United States with their families, or they were reunited later with their families. He was one of them. So I think when he came in 1960, he was 10 or 11, something like that. And he grew up in Miami. He became a professor. Now he's retired, and he keeps writing. He writes poems and essays, and many of his work is a discussion of being a bicultural person, a bicultural individual, and bilingual individual, and what it means to live between those two realities. So this one is called Last Mambo in Miami. It is also entitled in some other editions Bilingual Blues. So this one has several words in Spanish, and there is one that is very important, so we're going to talk about that in a minute. Soy un ajiaco de contradicciones. I have mixed feelings about everything. Name your tema, I'll hedge. Name your cerca, I'll straddle it, like a Cubano. I have mixed feelings about everything. Soy un ajiaco de contradicciones, vexed, hexed, complex, hyphenated, oxygenated, illegally alienated. Psycho soy, cantando voy. You say tomato, I say tu madre. You say potato, I say potato. Let's call the whole un hueco, the thing a cosa, and if the cosa goes into the hueco, consider yourself en casa. Consider yourself part of the family. Soy un ajiaco de contradicciones, un puré de impurezas, a little square from Rubik's, Cuba, que nadie nunca acoplará. Cha, 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 at the end. So, you know, he plays with the language a lot in his work, and if you check out some of his books, you will see that. And in this poem, the very important word is ajiaco. Do you know what ajiaco is? Now, it's a soup that is very, very, very heavy.
I know ajo is onion or garlic.
Garlic, yeah. So then ajiaco, it has ajo in it, but then it has many, many, many ingredients, and that's the main characteristic of it. And it's very heavy. You have one, bowl, you're going to sleep the rest of the day. It's thick, and you could see the chunks of the ingredients in there, meat and many vegetables. So it has, the roots are indigenous, yes, but it has also ingredients that came from Spain, for example. So it's a mixture of cultures in a bowl. And then he says, soy un ajiaco, because I am made of many, many things, many ingredients, many parts. And then I'm a contradiction. Now in the United States, being bicultural, being bilingual, I have my mixed feelings about everything. And the poetic voice struggles with trying to find who it is, this person living within himself, right? And he explores that in many of his poems and his essays. And then this, when he says vex and hex and complex, hyphenated, oxygenated, the word hyphenated is very important. You can also see it in the title, right? And he works with the hyphen a lot too. There is a book by Pérez Firmat entitled Living on the Hyphen. And having the word Cuban, hyphen American, and living on that hyphen all the time and going through one side and the other every day. Living comfortable on one side of the other, being Cuban, but being American, speaking both languages, is something related to what Ansaldúa was talking about with the border, crossing the border all the time. Now, Cubans, he was not able to cross the border to go back to Cuba, but he was able to go from one side of the culture to the other all the time. But at the same time, he struggled with that and named it a permanent contradiction. Now we have another Cuban writer. However, he was born in the United States, and if I'm not mistaken, I know he's from the Southwest. I think he's from Texas. So it's a different reality if you came as a Cuban exiled and grew up in Miami in a very Cuban dominant community during the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. Now Miami is a I call it a mini Latin America, right? Because there are people from all over Latin America there. But then the experience of being Cuban, of Cuban descent in Texas is different. And he talks about language in this poem as Pérez Firmat did in the previous one, but totally different. And see the title, it includes blues too, so the sadness is still there, but now we have the word shame. So a small shame blues. I live with the small shame of not knowing the multiple names of blue, to describe the night sky over New Mexico, to describe the light in my lover's eyes. It is a small shame that grows. I live with the small shame which resides in the absences of my speech, as I pause to search for the word in Spanish, to translate a poem to my father, who sits there waiting, who scans my eyes to see what I cannot fully describe, who waits for the word from me. The word that escapes me in the moment, the word I fear has never resided within me. It is a small shame that grows when indigo and cerulean are merely azul and not añil and ceruleo. So now, it's another type of a struggle, but it's related to what we have been discussing so far. Now is trying to reconnect with the heritage, with the ancestry, with speaking that language of that place where my family come from that I've never been, right? But it's a connection. So you connect through a language with the place of origin. And then the shame is formed by the incapacity of having the words in your mind fast, as your father does, have your grandparents do. So, and then we have different generations. Dan Vera is younger than Gustavo Perez Fermat, for example. And then being a second generation, a third generation, has the possibility of learning Spanish in a different way, as if you were raised in a Spanish-speaking country. So the experience with the language is different, the application of the language is different, and of course the influence of English over the Spanish will be different. So, it's the sadness is there. I think it is also a call for the effort, for the pride to be Latino and to be able to speak in another language and communicate with the ancestors. And it is interesting, the poetic voice wants to describe the sky using the different shades of blue in Spanish, but it doesn't want to describe the sky in Mexico. It wants to describe the sky in New Mexico, which is its home. And then to end, I have Javier Zamora. This poem, El Salvador, is actually the last poem in the anthology, just because of the alphabetical order, because of his last name. So Javier Zamora was born in 1990 in El Salvador, and he came to the United States when he was 9 years old, and he was by himself. His parents were in the United States already, and he came by himself, without family. He came with a group in a coyote, and crossed the border. So the memoir, Solito, which means alone, but a little person, I cannot find the word to translate Solito, explains the journey, his journey of crossing the border. It's a very thick book. It's very detailed. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. And it is, of course, he wrote it as an adult, right? But you hear his voice when he was a child. Yeah, in present tense. It's wonderful. You have to find it. But he's also a poet, and he has published a book of poems and many, many poems of that experience too. And now in this one, he dedicates this poem to El Salvador, to his country, but trying to protest because he didn't want to leave his country. But the country made him leave. So, El Salvador. Salvador, if I return on a summer day, so humid my thumb will clean your bird of salt, and if I touch your volcanic face, kiss your pumice breath, please don't let the cops say, he's a gangster. Don't let the gangster say, he's wrong barrio. Your barrios stain you with pollen. Everyday cops and gangsters pick at you with their metallic beaks, and presidents guilty. Dad swears he'll never return. Mom wants to see her mom. And in the news, black bags, more and more of us leave. Parents say, don't go, you have tattoos. It's the law. You don't know what law means there. But what do they know? We don't have green cards. Grandparents say, nothing happens here. Cousin says, here, it's worse. Don't come. You could be. Stupid Salvador. You see our black bags, our empty homes, our fear to say the war has never stopped. And still you lie and say, I'm fine, I'm fine. But if I don't brush Abuelita's hair, wash her pots and pans, I cry. Tonight, how I wish you made it easier to love you, Salvador. Make it easier to never have to risk our lives. He's talking to El Salvador and reclaiming that right to stay in his home that was taken from him. He was forced to leave. He was forced to leave everything he knew behind just to survive. Right? And then, if we think about the discourse we hear, go back to your country, what are you doing here? You're stealing our jobs and all that. But what's the story behind? People do not want to leave their country just because, right? They don't want to relocate, they don't want to start over. They have a reason to do that. And then Zamora is trying to show that he didn't want to leave, he was forced to. And if it was just a little easier to live there, he wouldn't have come here. But now he's here. Now this is his home. And, he's a voice of the United States and of Latino poetry. So I try to give you an overview of the book and try to share with you the importance of this anthology and the honor that we have, to be able to have it here in the library. And it was my pleasure. So thank you very much.